Only a month later, after Dune Part 2 released, we already have confirmation Dune Messiah is already in development. And since the movie also just released on digital, I think now is a great time to look back on it. I think in hindsight, my opinion might be a bit different than when I first watched it. So without all the hype and recency bias, I wanted to look back and find out if Dune Part 2 was overrated or not. I'm going to start off by saying I've never read the books, so when I first watched Part 1 back in 2021, that was my first introduction to Dune. Of course, I've heard about it before, but like very briefly. So for me, when I first watched Part 1, it was to see Denis Villeneuve's work. Because I'm a big fan of his work. I love Prisoners, I love Blade Runner, I love Incendie. They're all great movies. So when I heard that Dune was his passion project, I was actually more intrigued to see it for Denis himself than for the source material, which I know is very weird, but that was where I came from when I first watched it. So Part 2 came around, and I remember I rewatched Part 1 just before Part 2 came out, and I honestly didn't like it as much as I did back then. And that's kind of what sparked this video, because for me, Part 1 was like this masterpiece. And when I rewatched it, I think obviously it's not a bad movie at all, but I think a lot of the pacing is very rough to get through. And I think today we keep saying like, oh, if you think a movie is boring, then you have like low attention span or something. And whether that might be true to a certain extent or not, I think a movie should still be engaging. So the first time I watched it on opening day, it completely blew me away. When the credits started rolling in, the entire theater was in silence. Usually people talk, usually people are loud when they leave. It's like you get pulled from the movie. But it's like when the credits rolled, it felt like people wanted to stay there. Like people wanted more. Like people wanted to stay in the world of Dune, and that felt unreal. That for me was what really cemented this movie as like one of the best cinematic experiences I've ever had in my life. With such an engaging and compelling story, there's so many things to unpack here. I know the books have so much more to tell, and so that's why a lot of people were saying Dune was impossible to adapt, because a lot of it is a lot of yapping. Let's be honest, a lot of it is like inner monologue or political talks and shit. At least that's what I heard. I think that's what makes Denis really like the perfect director for this, because he really believes in the power of images and strong cinematography. And I think visual storytelling is one of his best attributes. As a person that didn't read the books, this felt very complete. I don't know if like the Space Guild and how like all these different houses, if we see more of them, if we focus on Paul, the Fremen, and the Bene Gesserit, I think we have a very complete story here. I rewatched it after a single week. I went to go back and saw it again, and I just rewatched it like a few days ago. Since it's coming out on digital, I don't know when's the last time I'm going to be able to watch in theaters, and I honestly wanted to recatch that feeling I was talking about, like the moment of silence after the credits started rolling in. Even though I loved Part 1, this movie is better in every single way. It's kind of crazy to think, because I really felt like Part 1 was the culmination of work of so many talented people, and I didn't think they would be able to outdo themselves. I did not think they were gonna take it to that level in this movie, and I was pleasantly surprised. Part 2 picks up like literally right after the ending of Part 1, and the opening scene for Part 2 is absolutely insane. I like the part where the Harkonnen soldiers come in and climb up the big rock is something I will never forget, and that imagery has been stuck in my mind. It's like one of the coldest opening scenes I've ever seen. Most of the people I've talked to said that they wish this movie was 3 hours long, which is funny because I know that's not how it works. You can't just like add 15 minutes to a movie like that. You edit it, and if it feels right, then that's what ends up being the runtime. But I just wanted to see more. That's my only complaint, which is crazy because there's so much to this movie. There's so much that could have went wrong. I don't think there's ever a moment where I felt bored or where I felt like it was dragging. And I watched it 3 times, and every part of this movie is just extremely well crafted. The cinematography is at its best. I think it's like somehow better than the first, and I think they did a great job with all the new characters that were added. Florence Pugh, Christopher Walken, Austin Butler, all of the characters fit very well into the already established cast. And one thing that really surprised me is Stilgar. I think Javier Bardem is one of the best parts of this movie. There's a lot more humor than I anticipated when first watching the movie, because in part one it's very serious. Maybe there's a few jokes here and there, but I think Javier Bardem is hilarious. But like, if you put aside all of the jokes, I think the fact that he's glazing Paul and like he goes from a friend to like a worshiper, I think it shows how dangerous fanaticism is. And I know that's the whole point of the movie, but I realized that not everybody like gets that. On social media, at least, I've seen a lot of people like making edits about Paul and like saying like he's cold and shit, which like they're kind of right, I'm gonna be honest. But the thing is, just because the movie portrays him as this cold-blooded like leader doesn't make what he does admirable. But I was kind of disappointed to see a lot of people didn't really get the message that this movie was trying to say. I know I've been glazing the movie a lot, but it's honestly that good. So is Dune Part 2 overrated or not? In my opinion, no, not at all. It deserves every single good review it got. It deserves all the hype. It deserves the renewing of part 3, and that's why I'm gonna give it my channel's first 10 out of 10 masterpiece rating. I think if any movie deserves it, Dune Part 2 is probably the closest thing to a perfect sci-fi movie I've seen. But anyway, I don't know if you remember the Gran Turismo movie, but there's a problem with the way they tackled a certain scene that I think is pretty problematic if studios just get away with that. And I made a whole video about where is the limit when using real life tragedies in movies. So yeah, see you.